series. Just me talking on the road. Today we are going to talk about actions. Already been talking about, so far we've mostly been talking about bolt action rifles, kind of generally as the choice for our hunting rifle, but today I wanted to talk a little bit about the other options, kind of the pros and cons of them, and also the short action versus long action versus magnum and all that kind of stuff. So let's get into it. So again, I'll be talking about these actions kind of in general terms. Obviously, you can tune them and improve them or get better quality, higher dollar, or custom, that kind of stuff. So this kind of varies, but in general, I will put our lever action, pump action, and semi-automatic hunting rifles kind of all together as and the reason I group them together is because these are all actions that we're going to have a lot faster follow-up shots, but in just kind of in general are generally less accurate than the classic bolt action rifle. Just again in general. So the lever action, if you're not familiar with them, if you've ever seen a Western or anything like that, I'm sure you've probably seen one featured in it. It's the rifle that literally has a lever on it that you work to eject and cycle the next round, next cartridge. These, especially with practice, allow for pretty fast follow-up shots. They are not as accurate as bolt action rifles in general. Again, can be. They generally have a tubular magazine, so the underneath the barrel you have sort of, if you think of like a second looking barrel almost kind of going out underneath the second tube, metal tube essentially. Those are where your cartridges or bullets, as people refer to them, for some cartridges, but that's where they are. They are one after each other, facing forward, directly behind each other. So generally, you do not use a traditional pointed bullet. Like if you think of a rifle, bolt action rifle bullet. If you just kind of picture that in your mind, it generally, it's what they call Spitzer type. It comes to a point. You do not want that in your tube type magazine like that, where the end of the bullet is pushing on the primer of the bullet in front of it. I have never tested it personally to see if a bullet like that loaded into the type of magazine, if you can jar it hard enough or whatever and cause those bullets to ignite, to go off and cause an explosion essentially. I have heard that it is actually extremely difficult to do that, but I've also heard people saying that can happen. So and it does make sense, that it would potentially be possible. Probably it's not exactly going to be an everyday thing, but why risk it when you don't have to? So generally they are you're using hollow points, wide, kind of pistol cartridge, or soft point, or I think it was Hornady came out with the Lever Revolution, where they added a kind of soft plastic tip to it, soft enough that it wouldn't ignite, but give you a little bit better ballistic coefficient. So because of that generally lessens your range somewhat. You're going to shed velocity faster. You're going to get more wind drift, that kind of stuff. But it was never really a big deal, because traditionally that's, especially out here in the East, people chose that for a lightweight, easy to handle rifle that allowed quick follow-up shots, so they could pump out a couple shots really quickly hunting in the woods. And again, weren't super accurate, but again, that didn't really matter to them. So I know today we want extremely accurate rifles. And I don't have a problem with that. The famous quote is, only an accurate rifle is interesting, and that's pretty true. But today we want under half, MOA. We want half MOA. We want out of our hunting rifle. I think that we have to have at least that to hunt with. That depends on what kind of range and how you're hunting. Like I said, in the East, stock hunting, where you're walking, you're coming up on deer and game, and generally, especially the way you're hunting, you most likely don't have 100 yards is like the max shot. Hunting that way, where you're not hunting clearings, openings, old roads, farms, that kind of stuff. You're walking through dense woods, not even really probably on a trail, on like a deer trail, that kind of stuff. Your steep hills, you're going to be coming up on deer pretty close before you or the deer realize. Whoever notices first, basically. But you're going to be pretty close. So in that kind of distance, under 100 yards, a 4 MOA rifle is perfectly fine to hunt deer with. Not an issue, honestly. And that's what they used to use, and that's what they weren't really that worried. It used to be, I know when I was little growing up, that was the norm, especially for old timers and stuff like that. There weren't lots of deer. Generally, you had to cover a lot of ground to try and find a deer at all. Backpack, hiking quite a ways in. They covered a lot of ground, and when they did, they were getting close. They were shooting, and generally they just picked up a box of ammo. They would shoot at a stump or pie plate, whatever, and if 50 yards they could hit it, that was good enough for them. If they were hit, could rattle off a couple shots pretty quick, hit it consistently, then that was good for them, and it worked. And they brought home plenty of deer, so fed their families and everything. So that absolutely works, and that type of hunting does work, but it's obviously got limitations. Like I said, if you're taking shots under 100 yards, a 4 MOA rifle is not that big of a deal. If you got depending on the size of the deer, 6-8 inch vitals area, you're aiming for the middle of that vitals area, and your shots are all staying within a 4-inch circle, then you got vitals. So ideally it's like that. So you start going pretty far out after that, though. That exponentially goes up. So a 4 MOA rifle, you know, shooting at 200 yards is an 8-inch circle now. So, you know, that's kind of barely squeezing by at that. But again, they weren't hunting like that. They weren't tailoring the ammo and, you know, making sure to sight in and all this stuff. They were using iron sights. They were just, you know, that was what they had. That was what they did. That was what they're used to. They practiced with, you know, and that was what they're comfortable and it did work. So if that's how you're going to be hunting, if you're going to be hunting in close brush, you know, timber, that kind of stuff, or want to just get a specific rifle set up like that, that is a great option, and still is. Yeah, works well, feeds well. The actions are generally strong. You've got a number of different options. Of course, the 30-30 has always been very popular and successful. You got the 32, basically the 30-30 with a 32 caliber bullet, the 2, you know, special Winchesters, some different names. It's a very old cartridge too. Then you have 35 Remington. You have 444 Marlin. You have 4570. You also have 44 mag. You have lever actions that are chambered in pistol calibers. You know, and honestly, even 357 Magnum, you know, is effective. Again, at shorter ranges, you know, 100 yards and ends like that, perfectly capable with the right bullet. You know, I know a lot of people freak out over that, looking at the numbers and velocity and that kind of stuff with that. They're like, well, that's too low. But those same people are fine with hunting with a, you know, a 4 or 6 inch revolver and 357 Magnum. So I never really quite understood that. So it's on the low end, absolutely. You have to be careful. You're going to have to pick your shots. There's definitely limitations with it, but it can be done. It does work, and it's completely legal. But again, these are for close in. If that's what you have, if you're going to be hiking, walking a lot, you know, close distance, that's a perfectly valid option. Many people did it for a long time, and still do. So it's not, you know, it's not really something I would say just should be totally forgotten or ruled out. It just depends on your situation. Now, if you're hunting wide open plains, antelope, and are taking shots at like 400 yards, not a good option. Not even close. But for what it is and what it's meant for, it is a good option. Pump action, not as common as the lever action. As far as our intents and purposes, I'd say very similar. It's just instead of a lever, you know, down by your trigger, you have a pump, just like a pump action shotgun. Works, you know, functions very similar. Again, you know, pretty quick. With practice, you can get off shots pretty fast. Generally pretty reliable. Depends on, you know, the specific gun, make and model, but most that I saw at least, you know, were pretty reliable, and it did a pretty good job. So then your semi-automatic rifles. Of course, you had generally the fastest follow-up shot with that, and again, these were all used to be very, very popular because the focus was all on follow-up shot, how fast your follow-up shot and everything's going to be. And growing up, that was extremely important. You know, I was taught that. Everybody I know was taught that. It's like that. You know, or I'm thinking it was like, I don't know that I want a bolt-action rifle. It's so much slower in the follow-up shot. You know, what if it doesn't kill the deer and it takes off running, and it, all that kind of thinking. So your first shot doesn't kill the deer, I should say. So, but nowadays it's not as much the focus. We're more focused on trying to kind of maximize our first shot, and again, generally they were less accurate. Depending on the rifle, the particular one. Some were very dependable and worked well. Just again, oftentimes just didn't have the greatest accuracy. But again, that varied how it was set up, all that kind of stuff. Especially we're talking, most of these older rifles, they were not bedded, they're not free floated, they're not, and of course the lever action and pump and stuff definitely were not. Your barrel was resting on the tube magazine below, or stuff like that. So there are of course things you can do to make them more accurate, but generally not quite as easy as what we would typically do with our bolt action rifles, as far as just simply bedding the action, free floating the barrel, and removing a lot of our variables and inconsistent pressure on the barrel, that kind of stuff. So with the semi-autos, Remington's offerings, very, very popular, were person I saw a lot of issues with. It just kind of depended on the rifle, and over the years they kind of changed and improved that to some degree and stuff, but it didn't always feed reliably. I had one in 30-06. It was actually my very first true deer rifle. Was a pawn shop. Got very, very cheap from a pawn shop that my parents bought for me, and as a young teenager, and I found out why it was very cheap and everything. It was 16-inch, had been like modified by somebody or something, and it did not feed very well. It kicked like crazy, jumped all over the place. I guess they kind of chattered essentially as it functioned. So I've seen many better functioning, better working. This was just a really bad one that somebody that didn't know what they were doing had screwed around with, and then just pawned it. But very fast, functioning, very fast follow-up shots for ones that worked, but generally accuracy wasn't great. Browning bar was, I've used and had some of them, have done very well. Of course, Benelli's, from what I've seen, have been great. The more moderns like that. Your AR-15, AR-10, nowadays, has become common for deer hunting. They, of course, do function, and feed reliably as long as they're set up properly and all that, but generally function well. The problem with them is, versus like your older semi-automatic hunting rifles, was they were set up more, I'm trying to think the best way to describe it. Basically, they were like taking a bolt action rifle and making it semi-automatic, keeping the same kind of fit and function and stuff. Sorry about that. Where were we? Before I got the phone call. Talking about the semi-automatic, the AR-15 versus the older semi-automatic hunting rifles. The older rifles were, like I said, took many function, kind of styling, kind of shape from, like the traditional bolt action hunting rifle, kind of the layout, the setup, wood stocks, all that kind of stuff. So they were a little more comfortable, a little easier to use, and looked a little closer to that. Versus today, of course, we've kind of gone away from that somewhat. Oftentimes using mostly plastic, synthetic stocked rifles, versus the wood, and having being magazine fed, like a detachable magazine versus a internal or box magazine. Some different changes like that, that we see today. So even in our bolt action rifles, we've kind of got away from that some, but AR-15s, AR-10s, obviously they were created for a different purpose. They were, originally a combat, type weapon. So they were, kind of styled, shaped, optimized for that. They can and do still work fine for hunting. Oftentimes they're not as comfortable to carry, and a little more awkward to carry. And what I mean by that is, again, kind of in the styling, instead of having like a kind of long, sleek wood stock or plastic stock, things like that. You have a bit wider, you have four stock, four end, you have your adjustable rear stock, you have a lot more metal on it, whether it be the your fore end, your barrel shroud, guard, all whatever else you've put all there. If you put a forward grip, if you put bipod, if you put all these different things, if you're using a sling, throwing it over your shoulder, packing it around, hiking, it's not quite as comfortable. It's a little more awkward generally. Generally balance is a little off too. And then of course if you have like a big 30 round magazine or something, again that adds something else that's sticking out there, kind of changes the balance a bit. Again, can kind of make it a little more awkward carrying, but all those kinds of things can be adjusted, and most places you can't hunt with a 30 round magazine anyways, so you're going to be using a smaller magazine, that's going to stick out less, that's going to have less kind of forward middle weight, and all that kind of stuff. So it absolutely can be optimized, and you can train and practice with it and get comfortable with it, and it's perfectly capable as far as that goes. It's not really an issue. Again, generally accuracy side by side, it's not going to be quite as accurate as your bolt action rifle, just in general. Can they be as accurate? Can you shoot one of them away with them or under? Absolutely. That's not saying that you can't. I'm saying that just in general, especially with like a cheap rifle or something like that, a cheap bolt action rifle is generally going to shoot more accurately, easily, I guess that's the best way to put it, than just a AR-15 or AR-10, just a cheap one. There are things you can do. You can get higher quality. There are forward, the fore end, fore guard, the throughout, all these kinds of things, making sure it never touches the barrel, that the barrel's thicker, that it's refloated, that it's all these different things absolutely can be done to make it more accurate, and they absolutely can be accurate. So that's not an issue, as far as, or I should say that it's not exactly impossible or anything like that. It's just, in general, it's gonna be a bit more work to get them to be as accurate as what you can get easily, out of a bolt action rifle. Just part of the system. You have a lot more going on with the semi-auto than you do the bolt action. So it's just more things you have to adjust, more things to kind of optimize and stuff. But absolutely can be done. If that's what you want, that's what you want to do, you absolutely can. So all these actions, like I said, where they really shine is closer range. range. And when I say close to range, I'm not, obviously 5 yards, is close range, but I mean like 100, 200 yards is where they're really going to shine. Because again, oftentimes, especially, denser terrain, with thicker brush, that kind of stuff, where, oftentimes it's going to be quicker when you see a deer or other game. They're going to be coming out of brush into the open, very quickly. You're going to go from cover to cover, once hunting season starts, that kind of stuff. But also where it can be definitely beneficial is what other things are out there. What other predators besides you are in your area or out there. Do you have trouble? Is there a problem with feral dogs, with coyotes, with wolves, with bears, with mountain lions, all that kind of stuff? And obviously I wouldn't use like a 223 to protect myself from a grizzly, but well, I mean, if I had to, that's better than nothing. But but what I'm saying is that is another situation where these faster actions can be very beneficial, is if they are going to need to kind of do double duty for protection. Generally I always carry a pistol on me, and caliber kind of appropriate for what's around. I mean, if there's, if it's just coyotes, if it's just, feral dogs, if it's, hogs, if there's, I mean, different things that I might run into while out hunting that are an issue. And not to say that the two-legged variety can't be equally dangerous. I mean, especially here in the East, we have lots of choke problems, and it wasn't that long ago that there was massive raids and busts and state parks and stuff where there were pot farms and things like that, where they set all kinds of booby traps out, and then there were drug dealers and all that out. And I mean, that is a possibility. I mean, that's not like that could never happen. I don't know that that's, depending on where you're hunting and everything, it's necessarily a big concern, but just being cautious and prepared is what I'm saying with that kind of stuff. So having at least some way to protect yourself, and if you're wanting to use that rifle kind of double duty, that can be effective, especially with if there's a lot of issues with feral dogs, with coyotes, with wolves. These the AR-15, the AR-10, can be very effective at that and be a very good option, as well as hunting your deer. So if that's something that's important to you, that's what you're looking for, then that may be a good option. And the Browning Bar, the Benelli, these, your other, I'd get checked out, Remington, that kind of stuff. Get checked out by somebody that knows what they're doing. Just make sure it's functioning properly and everything. As long as it's set up and working, I mean, they do just fine. I know plenty of people that hunted with them for a very long time without really any issues. If that's what you're interested in, that will work. Then the bolt action rifles, the different types of actions for bolt action rifles, is what we'll talk about next. The short action versus long action versus, because not really talked about much. Basically our long action is actually originally our standard action, honestly, and then you have like the actual Magnum cartridges. So like your H&H, your the original H&H, your Rigby, your Dangerous Game, African, big bore, cartridges, it's like that were quite a bit longer. So like the 7 rim mag, the cartridge that it's based off of, the reason it has a belt is because that's the original case was actually even longer than the 7 mag, was a Magnum action, and used the belt for head spacing because it was the diameter of the bullet was quite a bit bigger, quite a bit wider, and didn't really have a lot of shoulder to it. So they, instead of the cartridge coming to a stop on the shoulder, they put that extra rim in the back, kind of modeling after your old rim cartridges like the 30-30, that kind of stuff, that had a big rim at the very back of the case, the very bottom of your cartridge. They kind of took from that inspiration and head spaced off that. So the 264 Win Mag, the 7 rim mag, the 300 Win mag, pretty much all of Weatherby's cartridges, they all kind of built their cartridges off of that original case. So they had the rim that they had added to the end there, basically, the belt. And of course, it used to be said that the belt was there to hold in all that power, which really wasn't true. But it was the head spacing device, and still often use it. Pretty much is. So, anyways, but so originally your big cartridges, your big Magnums were actually really really long actions, which is longer than the standard. As far as how the actions work, the long or the short Magnum, it really doesn't matter, honestly. I know mostly from target shooting, there's, we kind of gained that, well, you have to have a short action, that they're so much better than a long action, that they're stiffer and faster and, and shorter and all this stuff. It's, honestly, it really doesn't matter. For target shooting, yes, they are trying to get, if they can get an extra 1/23rd or 6th or whatever of an inch off, down on their group, that's a big deal for them. That could be, winning a competition versus not. So, so in that kind of situation, yeah, it absolutely can. As far as for hunting and stuff like that, it really does not matter. As far as, well, the action's shorter, so you get a more compact rifle. Well, you're talking like half an inch. So, I mean, it doesn't really make that big of a difference. Ironically, it's the opposite usually, that it does matter. As far as being able to properly load out your cartridge, that's why, like, all these short action Magnum cartridges, as they tried to push it, the 6.5 PRC, the 6.8 Western, they're trying to push it to the absolute max, try and get as much velocity as they could, still in a short action, the short fat cartridge, because people wanted short action, so they didn't want to go over that length, so they pushed really kind of what would fit in the magazine, because that's really your biggest, unless you're going to single feed every single shot, which hunting isn't going to do generally, unless you might as well go with the single shot rifle at that point. But that's the biggest limiting factor. And when the cartridge starts out really, really long for that action and that magazine, you are generally pushing the bullet back in some and losing some of your case capacity, and you're not really able to optimize it quite as well. That's honestly, that's why, like your 6.8 Western, or especially the 6.5 PRC, a lot of manufacturers actually make it for a long action. Yeah, they load it in a long action. They just generally don't tell you. And I've had several people that were, well, I got this short action, I got the 6.5 PRC, and come look at it, it's actually they're going to get a magazine or something. And they're like, well, this won't fit. It's because the rifle's a long action. Because it's honestly too long for the short action anyways. So to be able to actually load out that bullet where it should be, to be able to get closer to the lands, and especially for like what we're doing, most people want to do now is a long long for caliber heavy bullet. If you don't load it out like you normally would or should, if you don't have the room to be able to do that because it won't fit in the magazine, then you're pressing that bullet back into the case and losing some case capacity and that kind of stuff. So that half an inch in that regard actually did make quite a bit of difference. So which I found was ironic, but anyways, don't worry about it. And part of the reason I always kind of laugh about, part of the reason I know that it really doesn't matter, it doesn't make that much of a difference, is a good example is Tikka. Tikka rifles are pretty popular. They do pretty well, pretty accurate, pretty consistent, function very well. They do not have different size actions. They don't have a short or a long action. They have one action, and they adjust the magazine, the follower, the different, they adjust those things depending on what size cartridge you got. So if you have a short cartridge, like the short action, that magazine follower, stop, that kind of stuff, shorten that space, so you don't have it overly long and cause issues with feeding. If you have a long action cartridge, like a 30-06, it's longer, but the action doesn't change. So obviously people aren't even aware of that oftentimes, and don't notice the drastically increased cycling speed of that bolt with the short action, or anything like that that's is claimed. So really don't worry about that at all, honestly. Like I said, I would just go off of, as we talked in the first video, your case capacity, what kind of velocity and stuff, and range, and everything that you're going to be hunting. Let that determine it, and then get the appropriate rifle, for what you have, or what you're wanting. I definitely would not try to be like, well, I would like to have a 30-06, but it's got to be a short action, so I guess I'll go with the 308, or the 300 Wisdom, or not bad cartridge. There's nothing wrong with them. I just mean don't let that be like, oh well, well, I guess I can't do that because I want the short action or the long action or whatever, I honestly just wouldn't even let that function, or I wouldn't really personally add that to my calculation, to figuring out. It would just be whatever, cartridge, whatever setup, I figured out that I needed for the setup, for how I'm hunting, for the game, for the situation that I want and needs, and then just go with whatever works best in. So then the last we'll talk about is the single shot rifles, and you have some different options as far as that goes. They're not quite as popular, of course, as the bolt action, but still have a pretty solid following, and people that really like them. You have a break them down into kind of two different categories as far as it goes. You have break action single shots. So like the H&R handy rifle, I think Henry has a single shot one similar now. You have, the Thompson Center, the Thompson Encore. Those are break action single shot rifles. They work well. And they have the benefit of, most of those you can change out the barrels. The way they're designed, you can change out different barrels for different calibers, try different things. So they can be very nice, especially for that. If you're wanting multiple calibers, or if you just want to try different stuff, you haven't really figured out what you want, what you like. You can get and trade different barrels and stuff, and it's not a firearm because you have the action and everything. So people regularly do that. I did that for a while with the Thompson Center. I liked that and liked trying, different cartridges, especially ones that aren't very common. Other than that, I probably would have had to get, some kind of custom rifle builds or something like that. So it was a good option for that. They are very handy, have good balance. Generally, the barrel is quite a bit thicker than your standard barrel because they don't really have any action. So if you got a 30-06 rifle, again, we'll just use it as an example. If you got a 30-06, just traditional bolt action rifle, and then you got a with a 24-inch barrel, and you got a Thompson Center with a 24-inch barrel. The Encore, I should specify. But if you got both of them with 24-inch barrels, the Thompson Center is going to be 4.5 roughly inches shorter in overall length because you don't have the bolt, you don't have the magazine, you don't have that action. You just basically have a pivot point, like if you've ever seen a double action shotgun, or double action, double barrel shotgun. It just breaks open, breaks in half basically, and pivots. It has a pivot pin, pivot point. It's significantly shorter. So if you're really wanting the most compact, rifle you can get, and lightweight, that's part of the reason why, their barrels were significantly thicker than, your standard bolt action rifle barrel, was because it's pretty much all the weight. Most of the weight of the rifle was the barrel. Which is good and bad. You're attaching the scope and things directly to the barrel. So you're not attaching stuff to an action like with the bolt action. So they generally are a bit more temperamental. All your single actions, are this way. As far as barrel harmonics and stuff like that, it is found more important with those rifles. Like I said, just because you are attaching so much stuff to the barrel, it can't really be free floated like what you would with a bolt action rifle essentially. So, you can end up for the same or actually slightly less. I set up a 270 and a 25-06 barrels, and it was funny setting it right next to my Winchester Model 70, with a 24-inch barrel. It was still half an inch longer than the Encores, and the Encores had a 28-inch barrel. Talk about really being able to hand loading and squeezing out all that velocity that you could off of the 25-06 or 270. The only bad thing with the Encores, handy rifles, all those break actions, is that it's not quite as strong. The Encores, I would say, probably were the strongest of all those different iterations, but yeah, they weren't quite as strong as some of your other stuff, so you were limited. So you didn't have really big magnums. You didn't have, you'd have, I mean, I saw 300 Win Mag, 7 rim mag, that kind of stuff. So most of your, I mean, honestly, most of the cartridges most people are going to be shooting, it wasn't that big of a deal. But anything that really had much more power or powder and just size, because of the design of it and stuff like that, just really couldn't do anything much more than that. So if you're really wanting some great big magnum and that kind of stuff, you really can't do something like that. Your other class of single shots, with Ruger's single shot, of course, being, I'd say, probably the most common and popular. Browning had a single shot for a while. Winchester has has a model out, although last I checked, they don't have hardly any cartridges for it. Very, very few, unfortunately, for it. But Ruger, like I said, was probably the biggest thing. Of course, you have Dakota, you have Merkel, you have several different companies, other companies, it's like that, smaller companies that make very, very nice, it's very expensive, but very nice single shot rifles. And the Ruger number 1, the way its action works, similar to the original Sharps, of course, and the Browning, the action is incredibly strong. You have essentially a little like lever actions. You have kind of a lever kind of right by the trigger guard, or well, it kind of is the trigger guard, but by the trigger, that you push out, and there's a large block of steel that is kind of the back where your bullet is up against. That is your action, essentially, that's going into a slot, going up into it. So similar to especially like the if you've ever seen the like pistol caliber Winchesters, things like that, it's a little like that, where you have a piece of steel kind of coming up. It doesn't really eject like a lever action. The single shots, these type, they do kind of push it out a bit. That was honestly one of my biggest complaints with the break action tops, break action types, was that you had to, it didn't really push it out very well, and you had to physically grab your spent shell and remove it, and load a new bullet, which with practice you can do pretty fast. But I found actually out hunting in the cold, wet, that kind of stuff, it kind of sucked oftentimes. I had one barrel in particular that, I don't think it was really, it wasn't cut very well. The chamber and stuff like that was kind of extra tight, and it was difficult to extract a shell with it, even not high pressure loads or anything like that. Just generally, just kind of a pain to remove, and in those kinds of conditions, it just made it even harder. So like I said, the Ruger, number 1, at least it does kind of help push it out some. So, and the action is extremely strong. Pretty much any cartridge that you can get a chamber for, it is going to handle. Unlike the others, it's extremely powerful. Very strong, I should say, action. But same kind of issues that you ran into with the other, with the harmonics, can be kind of extra temperamental on liking a very particular load, you know, wanting, yeah, just a very particular bullet, powder combination stuff before it really shoots well. But you are able to get those longer barrels, especially if you're doing some custom or something like that, you know, without it being, you know, super long. So, especially with the popularity of silencers, you know, I haven't seen it yet, but I wouldn't be totally surprised if, you know, they didn't kind of gain at least a little bit of popularity back, just because of that, because where it is so much shorter, you can have a standard length barrel for a given cartridge, and put a silencer on it, and your overall length isn't, you know, is definitely not, is significantly shorter than what, you know, you normally would have on a bolt action rifle. So, and we'll say with sticking point with me for quite a while was single shot. Was like, well, what if I have a follow-up shot? Well, it holds a single round. It doesn't have a magazine or anything like that, but it doesn't mean that you only get one shot and then that's just it. Yeah, you know, you can have them on your person in a magazine pouch. You know, you can get, you know, people put them on their slings, on belts, on, you know, little carriers on your butt stock, putting bullets in, and with some practice, you can load and unload pretty fast. You know, so you can still get that follow-up shot. The biggest thing with it is just trying to, you know, I would say the biggest benefit to a single shot rifle is you can really focus on trying to kind of maximize that one shot, your very first shot on a game animal and stuff like that, whether it be, you know, extra bullet, you know, barrel length to try and get, you know, squeeze out more velocity, you know, or just, you know, like I said, having, you know, a thicker, stiffer barrel, you know, or, you know, lighter overall, easier to pack, handle rifle. They do balance very well. You know, again, I kind of compare them to like a single shot or, you know, double barrel shotgun. It reminds me a lot of, you know, kind of their feel, their balance, that kind of stuff. So they handle well, pack well. Easy to carry around, you know, kind of like the lever action where, you know, you can use the sling and that kind of stuff, but honestly, you can just kind of grip it, you know, over the, just above the, you know, forward of the trigger and stuff. You can, it's basically kind of like a handle there, and you can just carry your rifle in your hand like that, just walking with it next to you. They are good options and work well. Just like I said, obviously limitations, and I'd say the biggest downside with them is that follow-up shot with dangerous game, or like if you're in grizzly country or something like that. You know, of course, there's no reason you can't still hunt with that. I would just probably have either bigger or more as my backup option. So either a larger caliber pistol, or maybe even carry a shotgun with me, or who I'm with have a shotgun, or, you know, some other option, you know what I mean, something that's with some power to it, where I'm not easily going to be able to use it on a charging bear or something like that. I'm going to get one good shot, but where it is slower, and especially in a stressful situation, adrenaline pumping and all that, you know, it is going to be more difficult to reload that. You know, practice and everything can help, and, you know, out in Africa, they do use single shots regularly. You know, guides and stuff do use large caliber single shot, double rifles, that kind of stuff, and, you know, they practice with it and practice in those kinds of situations, and are able to load and fire and everything very quickly and well. So, not to say that it won't work, it's just something to keep in mind. So, hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you all again. Please like and subscribe, and let me know what you think. You know, what your opinions are on the different actions and all this. So I'll see you later.